On Sunday, August 6, 1905, Dreamland Park opened its gates to a new attraction. A group of 48 Igorrote tribespeople, supposedly newly arrived from the Philippines. Supposedly. Once inside the park, they were escorted to a makeshift village, an enclosure that supposedly replicated the kind of buildings they lived in their home, the mountainous regions of Bontoc. Supposedly. Then, as the fascinated audience and members of the press watched, a dentist was let into the enclosure where he made a show of inspecting the Igorrote's teeth, and with great fanfare declared them to be almost perfect. Finally, as the tribe began to evaluate their ersatz village, Samuel Gumpertz, the manager of Dreamland Park, announced to the audience that the Igorrotes were so excited and thankful for their new home that they were going to celebrate by sacrificing and eating several dogs, their absolutely favorite foods. But this caught the tribe's people by surprise, because Samuel Gumpertz had told them that if they came to Dreamland, they wouldn't have to eat dogs anymore. Welcome to Meet Me in Dreamland, a video series exploring America's bizarre, strange, tragic, insane history through its earliest theme parks and amusement culture. Before we get going, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe and hit the bell. Also, patrons get to see this episode early over at patreon.com/TyBannerman for as little as $3 a month. Don't you wish you were seeing this early right now? Okay, enough shilling. Let's get back to the story. So to tell the story of the Igorrote tribe, who were displayed in human zoos throughout the United States, who were robbed and who were exploited and who were forced to eat dog on an almost daily basis for the amusement of tourists and park-goers, we gotta go back to the Spanish-American War. Okay, no groaning. We have to, because, who remembers anything about the Spanish-American War? I'll try to make it quick. 1898. The Cubans rebelled against the Spanish, the US got worried about losing access to sugar and tobacco and sent some ships to protect Americans. But then, remember the Maine. It got exploded off the coast of Cuba. Maybe it was a Spanish mine, or maybe it exploded all by itself, but no matter what, yellow journalism happened. The US thought, hey, maybe we need to help the Cubans rebel against Spain. And then bang, the US is at war with Spain. Fighting rages across various Spanish colonies, and a lot of it centers around the Philippines, which has also been revolting against Spanish rule for quite a while. The US thought an old-fashioned revolution in the Philippines would be great for helping the US cause against the Spanish, so they shipped in an exiled revolutionary leader, Emilio Aguinaldo, to strengthen the cause. And it worked. The US fleet won naval battles, and Emilio Aguinaldo won land battles, and the Spanish were defeated. Meanwhile, in Cuba, US Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt, Gatling guns, the Santiago campaign. To sum up, the US won. USA! 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 The US took possession of the former Spanish territories of Puerto Rico, Cuba, and Guam. But of course, having relied on the revolutionary actions of Emilio Aguinaldo, the US recognized the Philippines as an independent country. Hooray! USA! USA! Hold on. Okay, wait, I'm getting some late-breaking news from 130 years ago? Uh-huh? Really? Well, that seems weird because apparently the US did not recognize the Philippines as an independent country and instead annexed them as a US territory, and then fought a new war against their former ally Emilio Aguinaldo and the forces of the Philippine Republic. It was awful and ugly. 200,000 civilians died. The US set up concentration camps. Atrocities abounded. Yuck. Just a bad time. But got it. So, going forward to the early 1900s, the Philippines is now a US territory, but kind of a tenuous one. A lot of Americans are shocked that the US went back on helping out Aguinaldo, and find it very unsettling that the US is acting like an empire. Aren't those old-timey people so cute and naive? Anyway, to justify holding the Philippines, US officials argued that Filipinos just weren't ready for independence. That Filipinos were barely civilized and just couldn't handle all that dangerous freedom. And what better way to show just how backwards these Filipinos were than to get a whole crowd of them and put them on display at the Louisiana Purchase Exposition of 1904. So the US government did exactly that. The St. Louis, Louisiana Exposition of 1904 was one part celebration of the United States and one part imperialist propaganda. Among the usual exhibits on new inventions and agricultural advancements, the fair had a large area devoted to showcasing representatives of other cultures, and in particular, a number of these were groups deemed inferior or primitive by most white Americans: Native Americans, Africans, and a number of tribespeople from the Philippines. Included with this last group were a village of Igorrotes, which is a catch-all term for a number of different tribes who resided and still reside in the northern part of the island of Luzon, following the same traditional lifestyles they had for centuries at least. According to Claire Prentice, author of The Lost Tribe of Coney Island, they were displayed in, quote, an anthropological diorama surrounded by their native spears, drums, textiles, and pottery, all designed to underscore just how, quote, primitive the Filipinos were, and clearly not yet ready for self-governance. The St. Louis Igorrotes performed, danced, and held feasts, all using the traditional tools of their world. And they were a hit. Something about their lives, so different from the early 20th century United States, struck a note with the public, and they quickly became one of the most popular attractions at the fair. The US government's goal of portraying the people of its newest territory as harmless, simple, and too childlike to govern themselves gained a foothold in the newspapers and in the minds of the public. The manager of the village, a man named Truman Hunt, took note. Alright, Truman Hunt. Okay, this guy sucked. Opportunistic, bigamous conman, and a thief. He will definitely be playing the bad guy in today's episode. Hunt was born in Iowa in 1866, and he hadn't really made much of himself until he joined the army and fought in the Spanish-American War. He was given medical training and became a surgeon while enlisted, and after the war, he impressed the US government with his medical skills and his camaraderie with the tribes of the Philippines to the extent that he was appointed lieutenant governor of the Bontoc region, which the Igorrote called home. And at least at this stage, he was seemingly good at his job and engendered a certain amount of respect and trust among the indigenous people of the region. So when the US government had put out the call to recruit indigenous Filipinos for their propaganda purposes, Hunt was just the man to travel with the group and oversee their village in St. Louis. And when he saw the crowds, his eyes did that thing. You know, the thing from the cartoons where they roll back and turn into dollar signs. Yes, that's the one. After the successful Louisiana Purchase Exposition, Hunt returned to Bontoc with a plan. If so many people would pay to see the Igorrote village in St. Louis, they surely would pay for a group of Igorrote touring the country. And even better, if he organized it himself, they would pay him. So he put out the call in Bontoc. Adventure, riches, excitement, all this can be yours if you sign up to travel with Truman Hunt and perform for the United States citizenry for 1 year, all while earning $15 a month, plus tips. The Igorrote, who had performed in St. Louis, enthusiastically told the others how good of an experience it had been, and over 300 interested tribesfolk traveled to meet with Hunt about signing up. Truman Hunt selected 49 of them to join him. It's important to remember that these 49 people were individuals and not just a lumped-together group of Igorrote. Claire Prentice, author of The Lost Tribe of Coney Island, which you should totally read, does an admirable job of making sure that their personalities, motivations, and values stand out, even though there's not a huge amount of information about the individuals on the public record. Here are some of the Igorrote that Prentice highlights. There was Julio Balinag, the 21-year-old translator and Truman's right-hand man for much of this saga. Maria, Julio's wife. Friday, a 7-year-old boy who actually belonged to a different tribe, the Negritos, but tours as an Igorrote anyway. Tainan, 9 years old and known for his loud and enthusiastic singing. Famoale Ponce, the chief, or rather, the chief. We'll come back to that. Feloa, outgoing and gregarious. He had a wife and 3 children back in Bontoc. And Dengue, Feloa's friend who also had a wife and 4 children back in the islands. So let's talk about that chief, Famoale. Igorrote, as a rule, did not have chiefs. Their society was structured along non-hierarchical lines, but Truman, perhaps believing that Americans would expect a chief in the exhibit, and perhaps also thinking that it might be easier to work with the group by going through a compliant headman, insisted. And apparently Famoale was very pleased to be selected by Truman. And so this group of people who had never been off the island of Luzon or on a water vessel larger than a canoe now sailed to Hong Kong, boarded the RMS Empress of China, a 455-foot modern steamship, and sailed to North America. From Vancouver, they traveled to Seattle, where they built their first ersatz village on Blake Island, and Truman Hunt sent out a press release announcing that the exhibition would open with a traditional tribal spectacular: singing, dancing, rituals, and a genuine dog feast. And yes, in their traditional society, Igorrote were apparently known to occasionally eat dog, usually during a special occasion like after a successful headhunt. According to Dr. Albert E. Jenks, who completed an ethnographic survey of the Igorrotes in 1903, in Bontoc society, the use of dogs as a ritual sacrifice is held sacred. The last animal to be butchered after the usual chickens and pigs, celebrating a successful headhunt, namaka, by the warriors of the village. The dog is offered to perform the ritual called sumang, believed to drive away the spirits of the dead enemies. The dog is also used as a medium to heal people possessed by bad spirits or afflicted with illnesses. Other than use in these rituals, the Igorrote relationship with dogs was pretty typical. Sometimes pet, sometimes helper, only rarely supper. But the talk of dog eating had immediately captured the interest of the public during the St. Louis Exposition. Americans were both repulsed and fascinated by the practice. And Truman Hunt, who possessed a showman's spirit, knew that dog eating had to be a part of the exhibit if he were going to attract the kind of crowds needed to make him rich. And so he made sure to announce to all the newspapers that the Igorrote, starving after their long sea voyage, would, in fact, be feasting on their customary diet of dog during their very first engagement in Seattle. And they did. And it was indeed the talk of the town. After their short Seattle engagement, Truman and crew boarded a train and headed east to their ultimate destination, Coney Island. The week-long ride gave Truman plenty of time to continue to spread the word about the upcoming attraction. He met with reporters at every stop, encouraging them to fill their papers with stories of the head-hunting primitive dog eaters that would soon be on exhibit in New York. On Monday, May 15th, 1905, they arrived in the city and spent the rest of the week building their village out of bamboo at Coney Island's Luna Park. Frederick Thompson and Skip Dundee, owners of Luna, were eager to capitalize on the buzz about the Igorrote from the St. Louis Exposition, and so planned on satisfying all the things Americans would want to see: headhunting dances, rituals, craft making, and of course, dog eating. In order to drum up even more publicity after the first week of the show, Truman Hunt fell back on a trick he had already employed to great success in Seattle. He colluded with another Coney Island proprietor named Mrs. Mary Jackson. He arranged for her to create a scene outside the village, shouting and screaming that Prince, her beloved dog, had been eaten by those vicious Igorrote. Someone called the Coney Island police, who arrived and sure enough found dog bones in the tribe's copper kettle. The police could not prove that the bones belonged to Prince, or for that matter, that Prince had ever existed, but the New York papers went wild with the story anyway. Truman Hunt, of course, was on hand to explain that the Igorrote simply could not help themselves. In their native land, he told them, the only meat they ever ate was dog. The dog feasts were now a daily feature of the exhibit, and the Igorrote became the biggest hit on the island. But some problems started to arise. First of all, eating dog every day was not how the Igorrote usually dined, and within 2 months they hated it. Not only were they figuratively sick of the heavy, gamey meat, it was also literally making them unhealthy. The diet of rich, sodium-heavy dog meat, combined with the fact that the Igorrote were confined to their small village 24 hours a day, Truman Hunt reasoned that allowing them to leave the village and see the city would only cut into his revenue by giving New Yorkers a free show. Well, it was making them gain weight, go stir-crazy, and lose energy. At the same time, Truman continued to plant stories in the press about the Igorrotes being so ravenous for dog flesh that they were stealing dogs from all over the island. He figured that dog eating was his ace in the hole, and he wasn't going to let the public forget about it, no matter how unhappy the Igorrote were becoming. The performers, growing ever more nauseated by dog flesh and desperately wanting to leave their enclosure and actually see something of the new world they'd arrived in, went to Julio, the translator, to complain about the conditions, and he dutifully brought those concerns to Truman, who promptly ignored them. And so the situation may have continued for the rest of the summer if Samuel Gumpertz, manager of Dreamland Park, had not come calling. Dreamland, which had opened the year before, was in trouble. William Reynolds, the former senator who owned the park, had 2 ideas in mind when he came up with the plan to compete with Luna and Steeplechase. 1, to make money, obviously. And 2, to improve the morals of its attendees. As a result, much of the crazy fun to be had at Luna and Steeplechase was much more subdued at Dreamland. For instance, the dark rides focused not on haunted houses or fantastic scenes, but tours of Europe. Dreamland's Great Cyclorama was not, like at Luna, a fantastical trip to the moon, but a vision of God's creation of the world. And instead of an architectural fairyland, the park was laid out with order and refinement in mind, which weren't exactly profitable. And so people just weren't going in the kinds of numbers that Reynolds and his investors had hoped for. Samuel Gumpertz, a former circus man that Reynolds had brought in to make the park more profitable, had noticed the popularity of the Igorrote village at Luna, and he wanted those crowds for his park. And he was a clever man and realized that instead of going to the time and expense of recruiting and shipping another tribe over from the Philippines, he could simply, steal the Igorrotes who were already on Coney, getting Dreamland their very own tribe, and pulling the rug out from under the competition in one fell swoop. So he secretly approached Truman Hunt and basically kept throwing money at him until he agreed to move the Igorrotes to Dreamland. But Truman Hunt didn't bother telling the Igorrotes about this until the day before the move, when he announced to Julio that it was time to shift venue. He told Julio to inform the tribe that going to Dreamland would give them much more freedom, that they would no longer be forced to perform their most sacred rituals for a paying audience, and perhaps best of all, they wouldn't have to eat dog anymore. They were thrilled. Early the next morning, Julio roused his friends and instructed them to gather their belongings and move out. As they worked to evacuate, one of Luna's co-owners, Frederick Thompson, heard the commotion and rushed over, but he was powerless to stop them. As the Igorrotes began leaving Luna, he looked in vain for Truman Hunt, planning to confront the man over what looked like an imminently broken contract, but Truman was nowhere to be seen, and Thompson could do nothing in his rage but impotently curse the man's name, even as his most popular attraction slipped away right in front of him. Just as the sun was rising, the tribe made it to Dreamland, where Samuel Gumpertz, the park's manager, took pains to hide them from public view until he was ready. He then arranged to secretly transport a number of the Igorrote off of Coney Island and all the way back to the Brooklyn Bridge. The plan was to make it seem as if a whole new group of Igorrote had arrived in New York, and the press was alerted that they would be available to speak on the bridge itself. And this is where my video began, because when they arrived back at Dreamland, he had a special surprise. A dentist would check over their teeth in full view of the press. I'm not exactly sure why he thought a live dental examination would be an incredible feat of showmanship, but that's what he went with. After the dentist declared that the Igorrote had impeccable oral health, Julio was horrified when Gumpertz announced to the press that the tribesfolk were so pleased with their new home that they would now celebrate by feasting on one of their favorite foods, dog. So it all started again, and Truman Hunt pulled in money like never before, to the tune of $20,000 a week. But just in case you guys forgot that Truman Hunt is the villain in this story, a small matter cropped up right around then that gives us an indication of his true character. You see, while the money was pouring in, he got arrested and charged with bigamy. Yes, Truman Hunt had been married in the Philippines to a woman named Elsa, and he'd had a baby with her. But, it just must have slipped his mind. He stopped communicating with her sometime around 1904, and he kind of sort of married a lovely young lady named Sally in the US. A thing that could happen to anyone. But his original wife did not see it that way, and with his name in the newspapers in connection to the Igorrote exhibition, she wound up bringing charges against him, which led to his arrest. But Hunt got away with it on the technicality that his original marriage was in the Philippines, and New York State had no jurisdiction over their legal relationship. So he wiggled out of it, and amazingly, he even managed to spin the whole affair to portray Elsa as a vicious grifter when he told his new wife Sally about her. So Elsa and Hunt's first son were left in the dust as he continued his new life. Kinda hate this guy. As the summer came to a close, and in light of his recent legal troubles, Hunt deemed the time perfect for splitting up his Igorrote performers into 3 groups and sending them on tour to different parts of the country to maximize the off-season profits. His group traveled to Memphis, Kentucky, and the State Fair, and you can bet that he made sure to give plenty of interviews where he claimed that he had to provide 3 dogs every day for them. The tours were successful, and the cash kept rolling in. At first, Julio, Feloa, and the other Igorrotes were by and large happy with the change in scenery and the opportunity to see more of the United States, even if dog was still on the menu. After all, they only had a few more months of their one-year commitment, and then they could return home with more money than they'd ever seen in their lives. Speaking of which, Julio had made a few overtures to Truman Hunt to get an accounting for that money, which Julio estimated at around $5,000 total for the 6 months that they'd been in the US. Truman, however, explained that he had to keep the money himself in order to protect the tribe from throwing it away on alcohol and gambling. Not that the tribe drank or gambled, mind you, but they could start. When January arrived, the Igorrote were dismayed to find that they had not begun the journey home, and instead had an engagement in New Orleans. On January 26, something occurred which sent shockwaves through the tribe. During one of the mock battles that the Igorrote performed for tourists, an Igorrote named Pekuan suddenly died of a heart attack, possibly because of a combination of the unhealthy diet and the stress under which they had been living. Feloa brought his body into a hut, and the tribe prepared to perform their mourning rituals. But there was still a large crowd outside, and Truman Hunt, not willing to let a payday go by the wayside, ordered the tribe to go back out and perform for the crowd. They did, though they resented it. That night, when the crowds had gone home, they performed their rites. Meanwhile, Truman Hunt had been drinking throughout the day, and the more he drank, the more he became suspicious. Feloa, in particular, seemed to be carrying a rattan bag over his shoulders. What could he be keeping in there? Finally, Truman Hunt called for his security guard and entered into the village, demanding that Feloa give him his bag. Feloa refused, and Truman physically attacked him, striking him and pulling the bag from his back. Sure enough, Hunt found $50 worth of coins inside, which Feloa had been gathering up from the money the crowd threw to them. Money that rightfully belonged to the tribe, but Truman seized it anyway. This marked a major turning point in their relationship with Truman Hunt. The next night, Feloa and several of the other men made an escape attempt. Under cover of darkness, they managed to climb over the fence and run off into the New Orleans street. But they didn't make it far. A kind passerby showed them the way to get to the police station, but the New Orleans cops in 1906, not so sympathetic to indigenous Filipinos wearing loincloths and barely speaking English. Rather than notice their clear distress, the cops returned them to Truman Hunt, who told the police that the poor suspicious Igorrote had been frightened of a ghost. He would take them back to their village and explain to the ignorant savages that they had nothing to fear from the spirits of the dead. No, all they really had to fear was Truman Hunt. He posted more guards and planned more tour dates. The fact was that Truman Hunt held all the cards in this situation, and short of somebody murdering him, there wasn't a power on earth that could stop him from doing exactly what he wanted with his captive Igorrotes. Except maybe the US government. And this is when Truman got a letter from the US government. All those months ago, when Hunt had first imported Feloa, Friday, Tainan, and the rest for their US tour, he had to go through the Governor General of the Philippines and sign a $5,000 bond ensuring that he would take care of the group and send them home safely. In the US, the responsibility of enforcing the document now fell to the Department of Insular Affairs, a subgroup of the War Department, and the letter reminded Truman Hunt of his agreement to return the Igorrote to Bontoc by April. This annoyed Hunt, who was still making good money with the Igorrote, and didn't see any need to stick to that deadline. Uncomfortable with the fact that the US government had found him, he packed up the tribe and fled as soon as he could, leaving no forwarding address. In May, he and his group of captives began performing in Chicago in an even more dismal than usual ersatz village. According to Prentice, there were no trees or plants. The living accommodations consisted of one half-finished tribal hut and 3 small A-frame huts. The Igorrotes were filthy, their bronze skin caked in dirt. By this time, the Igorrote were well and truly worried that they were never going to go home. It was now a month after the 1-year mark, and Hunt showed no sign of arranging any sea voyages. The situation must have seemed more hopeless than ever. Except for the fact that a man like Truman Hunt tends to make enemies. In Chicago, at the same time as him, a man named Richard Schneiderwind was exhibiting his own troop of Igorrotes. Yes, this was a thing. It was like an Igorrote craze. And Schneiderwind had had a few run-ins with Hunt over the years and didn't like him at all. When he saw the way that Hunt was exhibiting his kidnappees, the deplorable conditions, the constant dog meat, he sent a telegram straight to the Bureau of Insular Affairs. The government, remember, had backed these exhibits as a way to show just how primitive and simple the Filipinos were in order to justify the United States' continued occupation of the islands. But when the Bureau received this letter, they were suddenly worried that Truman Hunt seemed to be outright abusing the Igorrotes, and the fact would find its way into the papers and give ammunition to those who framed the U.S. occupation of the Philippines as somehow exploitative. The Bureau immediately sent out an inspector to Chicago to verify the claims. The agent was named Frederick Barker, and he planned to take action. On June 26, 1906, 2 months after the Igorrote were supposed to have returned to the Philippines, Barker arrived at the San Souci Park in Chicago, where the Igorrotes were on exhibit. Amazingly, the show was in the process of actually being shut down as a result of a contract dispute between Hunt and the park owners. Seeing an opportunity, Barker met with the park owner and arranged to accompany him to a saloon meeting with Hunt to discuss the dispute. Barker kept his identity secret and watched as Truman Hunt got drunker and more belligerent about the tribe, making it clear that he had no intention of sending them back to their island home for the foreseeable future. Then, Barker announced himself as an agent for the Department of Insular Affairs, blindsiding Hunt. Hunt maintained that the performers were working of their own free will and that they were happy. "Prove it," said Barker. "Fine," said Truman, and he took Barker back to the village. This did not go well for Truman. Julio, the interpreter, no longer willing to follow Truman's orders after all the abuse he and his compatriots had suffered, immediately told Barker that he and the others wanted to go home. Barker announced that the government was now taking possession of the tribe and for the time being would allow Schneiderwind, Truman's rival, to display them in his Igorrote village elsewhere in Chicago. Hunt was actually skulking around the saloons of Chicago, scheming to find some way to get out from under the government's thumb. At one point, he sent out one of his thugs, a brute named Callahan, to kidnap Julio, the Igorrote's de facto leader and interpreter, and forcibly bring him to one of the bars that Hunt frequented. There, a very intoxicated Truman Hunt tried to intimidate Julio into signing a document that he had never been mistreated. But Julio stood strong. Angered, Truman Hunt had Julio locked up in his hotel room. Hunt filed a writ of habeas corpus accusing Agent Baker of having kidnapped the majority of the Igorrote and held them against their will. The next day, Barker, Hunt, and all of the Igorrote arrived at court, and, well, things did not go the way that Truman Hunt had probably hoped. Instead of returning the tribe to Truman Hunt, the judge ruled that the Igorrote were free to go home to Bontoc or to stay in the U.S. at their own discretion. Most of the group chose to leave, but Julio, Feloa, and a few of the others decided to stay in the U.S. to serve as witnesses in the government's prosecution of Hunt. Hunt was again arrested and formally charged with embezzlement. Larceny charges from his time in Tennessee followed, and soon he was shuffled from the Chicago jail to a Memphis-bound train. By this time, it was February of 1907. Most of the Igorrotes had gone back to Bontoc in September of the previous year, and Hunt's defense was proving surprisingly robust, mainly in terms of backroom dealing that resulted in dodgy legal delaying tactics. Meanwhile, the U.S. government had come under heavy fire for the cost of its occupation of the Philippine Islands. Far from an open and shut case, the multiple charges and trials and retrials against Truman Hunt had proved both frustrating and financially costly for the Bureau of Insular Affairs. When Hunt managed to go MIA, Colonel Clarence Edwards, the chief of the Bureau, under increasing administrative pressure to put this whole embarrassing mess behind them, made a decision that came down to a calculation of dollar amounts and political expedience rather than justice. Drop it. It was taking too long, it cost too much, and it was becoming too embarrassing. More than 2 years after Hunt had gathered his band of Igorrotes and began this whole saga of exploitation and cruelty, it was over. The Bureau agent had been defeated. Not by the merits of Truman's defense, not by his own abilities or tenacity, but by the very government that had put him on the case in the first place. At the end of the day, the U.S. Igorrote exhibitions had been used as pawns by the U.S. to make a case for its move toward imperialism. The men and women who had been lured by false promises and then held as literal captives in 20th century America, forced to debase their traditions and dine on dog meat for the amusement of fair-going audiences, just weren't useful to the government that was supposed to protect them and assist them in their country's move toward freedom. Justice didn't show up on that tally sheet. Only money, propaganda, and embarrassment. The Igorrote and the case against Truman Hunt were now a liability, so the Filipinos were each given $30, a tiny sliver of the money that they were owed, and then sent back to where they had come from. And frankly, Julio, Feloa, and the other 5 Igorrote who had remained behind were just happy to go home by this point. What happened to them after they returned? Well, we just don't know. Record-keeping in the US-occupied Philippines was spotty across the board, and for the different tribes in Bontoc, damn near non-existent. All we can do is hope that they were happy and leave it at that. And Truman Hunt. He never returned to his former prominence as a showman or a government bigwig. Instead, he moved to Oklahoma, then Iowa, and, somehow penniless after squandering the fortune stolen from his Igorrote escapades, turned to selling snake oil measles cures before dying in 1916 at the age of 49. He was buried in an unmarked grave. The Philippine Islands themselves were invaded by Japan in World War II, and then finally gained their independence in 1946. And I bet everything's turned out just great for them. Thank you for watching. As I mentioned, much of the information in this video came from Claire Prentice's nonfiction book, The Lost Tribe of Coney Island, which you should definitely check out. I need to make sure I'm not holding it upside down. If you didn't subscribe, etc. earlier, well, you get another chance. My Patreon is patreon.com/TyBannerman if you're interested in supporting videos like this. My current goal is for my Adobe subscription to pay for itself, so I'd love it if you could help me out for as low as $3 a month. And, as always,
Thank you for meeting me in